Afternoon. I'm very excited to be talking with you today. I'm going to be sharing a first glimpse at the results of our province-wide survey that examined stress, mental health, and coping among Alberta farmers. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land our farms exist on and the land that we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many people, presently subject to Treaty 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, Chine, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis people of Alberta. So this includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived in and cared for these lands for the generations before us. And we are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We would not be here without them, and we make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude for those whose territory we reside, farm, and live on, while recognizing the historical impacts of settlement on these lands. And we wish to express a common goal of care for our water and natural resources for all generations to share in. So with that, welcome to this webinar. I'll introduce myself in a minute and those of my colleagues, but I would like to start with a story. So with that in mind, last week I was at a conference. And while I was at this conference, it was a big international conference on quality of life, and I presented work on farmers and mental health. And I can't tell you the number of people who either came up to me and said, well, that's an interesting population to study. I never thought about their mental health. Or I'd get the other side of people who were familiar with the issue, and they said, this is a real issue. So the people who were familiar with the issues had some sort of connection to farming, while others thought it was an interesting sample, but it had just never been on their radar to study farming mental health. And this is a very common experience for those of us who venture beyond the agricultural groups and talk about research. And so coming from a farming background myself, I've always been fascinated with how others view farm life, whether it's on TV or movies and news stories or pictures. And so, for example, I just quickly, search the internet for using some basic keywords of farm life images. And these were some of the first ones that popped up, right? There's looking at these, right? We see a lot of sunny weather, a lot of smiling faces, clean clothes, neighbors living close by, and it all looks really peaceful and idyllic, right? But if you scratch the surface of that a little bit, you'll see that a farmer's life is quite different. Okay, so one of the things that we have learned is how a farmer's life is quite different. So what I have here are just some quotes from some of the research that we have done in the past year. But some of the major issues that farmers face is essentially that there's so much invested in the land. The farms themselves are quite large, even though there's not as many. But as this farmer mentioned, right, it's the magnitude of what's involved. So he's thinking not about just his farm, but also his family. We've also seen for some of the farms that there is diseases that can impact an entire flock or herd. And we saw that in the last 2 years with avian influenza. And then these large multi-generational farms, many of them are still family farms. And while that comes with benefits of being able to work alongside your family, there's also challenges, right? So there's going to be maybe some family dynamics or some challenges, especially as these farms grow and become quite large. And also it can impact someone's sense of their self-concept, right? Who are they as a person if they've lived their entire life as a farmer, but now maybe it's time for them to transition out of farming and let the next generation go forward. Okay. And then if that wasn't enough, right, we also have that there are, in the last couple of years, that there have been additional challenges. So in Alberta alone, right, we've seen droughts and wildfires and flooding and pandemic-induced inflation and supply shortages, causing an increase in input costs. And then these costs are further increased by the war in the Ukraine. So it was interesting. There was a report in 2023, a Farm Input Market Outlook by Farm Credit Canada, and they projected that Canadian farmers will spend a record $23.1 billion on fertilizer, fuel, chemical, and seed this year, making 2023 a seed and oilseed crop, so just one industry in Alberta, the most, quote, the most expensive ever planted in Canada, end quote. So that brings us to our goals today. So in this webinar, I'll talk briefly about what is AgKnow, who we are, and then I'll get right into the details of the study. So we'll talk about the stressors that farmers face, the mental health outcomes, and then I'll spend some time also looking at how that compares to national data. And then we'll end by talking about coping strategies. So first, a little bit about AgKnow. So we are a small team of individuals, and I'm going to invite each one of the my colleagues here to introduce themselves. So first, Linda will share who she is and what she does, and then Crystal, and then I'll introduce myself. So Linda, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Linda Hunt. I am a professional agrologist, a farmer, and the director of AgKnow, the Farm Mental Health Network, which is an initiative of Erica, which is not-for-profit, farmer-led board that works, or association that works to help farmers adopt and apply innovative research on their farming operations.
Okay, and Crystal?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to this. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. My name is Crystal Fullerton. I am the program coordinator with AgKnow. I've been involved in mental health for a while. Originally came from PEI, where they have the Farmer Assistance Program, something that's been running for over 20 years. And so being able to come back to Alberta and to help them get theirs started going is something I'm very excited to be part of, and I'm very excited to see we've got 55 people here already. So I'm hoping you all have the same amount of passion and desire to see this go through. And yes, I hope you enjoy the session today.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. And I'm Rebecca Perk-Stevenson. So I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, and I've been there since 2008, and I'm the current lead researcher at AgKnow, and I've been involved since the beginning. I'm an applied social psychologist, so I do a lot of community-based research, and I work directly with farmers and on a range of issues from suicide, mental health, and addictions to farm transitions and succession planning. And with all of the work that we do, this research will be used to help create programs, inform policy, and this work is also close to me. My family had sheep and we had horses growing up, and I also worked as a laborer in a large-scale turkey operation that helped pay my way through school. I moved to Camrose about 15 years ago, and being surrounded by the farming communities really felt like home. So even though we all have different backgrounds, we have a common thread of the experience in farming or in agriculture. And I just would be remiss if I missed this slide. I think I jumped ahead because I have two screens open. So about AgKnow. So now they know who we are, what do we do? So our mission is to destigmatize mental health and promote resilience among farmers and farm families so that they can lead healthy, fulfilling, and productive lives. And our vision is to create a shift in farm culture so that thinking about mental health just becomes something that we do. It's just a natural part of the job. Okay. So now I also wanted to share some of the work that we're doing as part of this my team at the University of Alberta. So I work with undergraduate students, and we've been busy in the last year collecting data, doing research, because there really wasn't anything in Alberta. So we're playing a bit of catch up, and then in the coming months we'll be sharing that data with you. It's all very exciting and interesting. And then I have a small army of research assistants at the University of Alberta who work with me, and it's become a bit of a mentorship program. All of these students have some sort of tie to either farming communities or they're farmers themselves. And they're all in their third and fourth year of undergrad, And they wanted to get involved because this topic was important to them, but also to take this information back to their communities. And I would also want to just point out we have Sarah Diedrich, who's at this corner here. She was the one who worked really closely with me on this project. And even when her work term was done, she wanted to see this project through. So she lives in Austria right now. So we still work together. There's a lot of early morning and late meetings that we do. But yes, I really appreciate her commitment to seeing this project. So she's been helping with the analysis. Okay, so let's get right into this. So we talked about AgKnow, who we are, a little bit of background. So, but before we start talking about this research study, right, what do we know about farming mental health? So the most commonly reported data comes from our friends at the University of Guelph. So in 2015, 2016, Dr. Andrea Jones-Bitten and her team, they surveyed about 1,100 farmers across Canada. And you can see these, I'm going to focus on a couple of rates here. So we have 35% of farmers met the classification for depression, and 58% met the classification for anxiety. So that's, mild to severe levels of either depression or anxiety. And so these rates are much higher than what you would see in the general public. And in fact, agriculture has been rated as one of the most stressful occupations. So this research is really significant in that it was one of the first in Canada to really put a spotlight on the need to address farming mental health. And when we were examining this data, and we were kind of looking within the province, right, like our own farmers, how do we compare? How are we doing? And one of the, when we were looking at this data, well, it did really help us kind of turn our attention and look at farmers. It was difficult to know for sure how well it might apply to Alberta. So about 73% of this sample were Ontario farmers. And there was only, I think, 8% or about 98% of farmers in their sample were Albertans. So then we wanted to know, how do Albertans compare? Do we have similar rates? So this brings us directly to our present study. And so our research question was, what is the rate of stress, mental health outcomes, and coping strategies among Albertan farmers? So how did we do this? So we designed a survey. So we used many of the same survey scales that Andrea Jones-Bitten used. And then we also added additional scales to kind of get some more precision. So after going through an ethics review at the university, we launched this online survey in February 2023, but the bulk of the surveys came through in the summer. So we recruited broadly throughout the province so that we had good representation of agricultural industries and good representation across like the province, north, central to south. And anyone who was over the age of 18 and identified as a farmer was eligible to take the survey. And for those who, if they wanted to, when they're done, they had an opportunity to put their name into a random draw to win a prize of $200. So we had 3 of these draws. And that was also a method that Dr. Bitten-Jones used in her research also. It's pretty common. So who did the survey? So let's get right into the results. So we had a large sample of 354 farmers. In fact, for all of our research, the response and the participation from Alberta farmers has been really overwhelming and positive. And as you can see from this chart, we have pretty good representation across the industry groups, and it aligns pretty closely to what we see in terms of numbers across these industry groups in Alberta. And just like any survey, there are people who will, despite your best efforts to screen them out, they take the survey. So one of the jobs before we did any analysis was to make sure that our sample are just Alberta farmers, they meet the criteria, and then pull everyone out. So that doesn't belong out. In our case, we actually had Canadian farmers outside of Alberta and American farmers take our survey. So we had to separate them out, and they actually served as an important comparison sample. So in some way, it was beneficial that they took the survey. But today I'm just going to be sharing the Alberta data with you. Okay, so, and also as you see, so we had good representation, not just across the industry groups, but also across gender. So a pretty good balance of men and women. Oftentimes in surveys, you get so many more women completing it than you do men, but this was pretty balanced. We had, again, like a good representation of like what exists in the demographic. So most, were married or living with a committed partner. And then most of them were either the farm operator themselves or were like worked on the farm and were related to the farm operator. And that's what we want to see, right? We wouldn't want to see a completely unbalanced sample. And this all gives us, I spent a lot of time looking at this part of the survey before we even get into the results to ensure that we have like sound data, right? Things are valid. Okay, so let's focus on stress first. So for a little bit of context, in 2020, Farm Culture Canada reported a list of farm stressors that Canadian farmers face every single day. And while it's useful to have a list, it was hard to know the relative importance of each of these stressors, right? Is long hours the same as finances? So what we did was we took this list and then reviewed all the other research on work stress, and we created our own survey to measure farm stress. And there were 20 items and plus one open-ended question in case we missed something. And then each of these 20 items were rated on a 4-point scale. So that something that was rated higher meant more stress, more worry. So what did we see? So here's what we found. Now I know this is small, and I'm not going to go through all of it with you. But what I wanted to point out is the variability across these stresses, right? So by including a rating, one of the things that we did was add precision, we can more precisely measure what these key stressors are and even break it down by gender, by age, by industry differences. And, but even still, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way that we could somehow group or cluster these items together, right? So it's just easier to communicate. And there is. So we used a statistical technique called factor analysis. And this helps us identify clusters or categories. And then we look at each of these clusters and the items that fall within each, and then we give each a label. So let me show you what that looks like. And it just facilitates communication. So we found that there were 5 farm stress clusters or categories. Right, and we gave each of them a label. So the first one is uncontrollable factors. And this was a really prominent one. And again, like the higher scale means like it was more worry most of the time for farmers. So uncontrollable factors, that included, dealing with bad weather, equipment breakdowns, time pressure, all the things that were really outside of their control. Work hazards, that included handling dangerous chemicals or being around dust, operating hazardous machinery. Third one was isolation, and that was, having few close neighbors, being far away from shopping centers or healthcare. Number 4 was planning and future financing or planning and future finances, and this was getting loans or planning for retirement, thinking about succession planning. And then the last one was environmental and public pressure. So this included environmental regulations, public perceptions of farming. So collectively, like these stressors explained a big proportion of farmer stress, so about 65%, and that's quite large. So a lot of this would be like those external pressures. And then the remaining bulk, right, what else is accounting for stress? There might be some other factors that we don't have here. However, most likely it could be things like personality differences and background of individuals. That's accounting for why they're experiencing the stress they're feeling. And then I'll share with you just a couple of the open-ended responses. So when we looked at those, and again, we included always those open-ended responses in case we missed something. There were, financial concerns. So about the rising cost, making it really difficult to hire extra help, having to get large loans, the fear of losing the farm. And then another common concern was government involvement. So that's, especially through taxes and policies and regulations. And there was a general undertone of, you know, a mistrust for government, right, at different levels. For example, one of the quotes was like, you have to keep an eye on the tax man. Okay. So with these stresses, how does this translate into health outcomes? Ooh, actually, I have this. I thought I would show you. Okay. So one of the things with the data, and because it's a large enough sample, we can actually look at industry differences, right? So like, are there any differences in how different groups respond to stress? And there are. So there were two significant differences, which might not surprise you, right? But so for uncontrollable factors and isolation, that's where we saw some differences. Otherwise, the groups are like, these are all stressors. But for uncontrollable factors, right, it was highest among the beef farmers, the grain farmers, the beekeepers. Again, there's a lot in what they do that might be out of their control. And it was lowest for poultry farmers. Again, there might be things in there in how they operate their day that is more regulated, it's more stable. And then for isolation, this was highest among dairy, pig, poultry, and sheep farmers. But lowest for beef, grain, horticulture, and beekeepers. And while we might, wonder, well, why? We can't answer necessarily why, but what this does, I mean, we can speculate and we can ask and return this data back to farmers and share these ideas. But what this helps us do is that it helps us ensure that we are kind of pointing ourselves in the right direction by asking more relevant questions, and we can provide more relevant support instead of creating a blanket program just for everyone, right? So it just highlights that there are differences within the groups. Okay. All right, so again, what does this mean for outcomes? So how did maybe the stress translate into health outcomes? Okay, so I think that the easiest way, I had to kind of return to my professor hat to think about what's the best way to explain this and show this data. So at the beginning of this presentation or this section, I talked about Andrea Bitten-Jones's data. So what I have here, okay, is essentially this, right? That 35% of farmers in their sample reported to have that meeting the classification for depression. So that's what we have here, right? And on this chart, it's color coded. So what you want to see is a lot of green, not a lot of red. But 2015, 2016, that was pre-COVID. Like, a lot of things have changed. Is there any new data that would be more helpful to explain and be a comparison group? And there is. So let me show you that. So what we have here is we have some sort of mid post-COVID data. So we have the Canadian norms data. So this was collected by the Mental Health Research Canada. This is from their poll number 6. And then we have from the University of Guelph team, we have some other farming data. So this was data collected by, a sample of farmers across Canada, about the same number. I think it was over 1,000, but it was collected in 2021. So we're in mid-COVID. So this might give us just a bit more, a better comparison to understand how farmers are behaving. We see that there is an increase in depression, post-COVID or mid-COVID. And it aligns pretty well with like the Canadian data. However, farmers, that national data 2021, right? Farmers are experiencing more, like, higher levels of depression than the Canadian norm, which is in line with what we would expect. So what about Alberta? So what did our data show? So here's us at the bottom. Okay, so again, in this chart, you want to see more green than, yellow, orange, or red. But looking at our data, right, what do we notice? Right, we notice that there's higher levels of mild depression, moderate to severe levels of depression among our farmers. And then one of the things, and well, given the stress that has come post-COVID, the relatively few mental health resources that are either available or used by farmers, and a general awareness in society about mental health, that helps explain these findings. And one of the things that a researcher does whenever we go through survey data is to look at the pattern of responses to know whether or not things are valid, right? Are people responding the way they should? So we did a bunch of those sort of random checks. And essentially what you're looking for is like, are participants responding in the same way across different items or different survey scales? And they were. And then also in combination with the other studies that were happening at the same time, it was all telling a very consistent story. All right. So what we find here, though, is that Alberta farmers, they report higher levels of depression than what has been reported by the National Survey of Canadian Farmers, and it's higher than the Canadian norms that were collected mid-COVID. Okay. All right. So let's we're going to focus on anxiety. Depression and anxiety are the two mental health outcomes I'm focusing on in this for right now. And here we have, again, I'll just highlight Dr. Andrea Bitten-Jones's data here and ours. Go back up. There we go. So what I have circled here is that 57 or 58% of farmers meeting the classification for anxiety in that original study that the University of Guelph published. So if we compare that to the mid-COVID, post-COVID rates, how did anxiety change? We see it changed a little bit. So the 2021 data here, that's from the University of Guelph, another national sample that they did, and we see that anxiety kind of decreased. And no, that does make sense. They had a lot of programs that were really targeting farmers, so it could be that this change is a reflection of those efforts. But how did Alberta compare? So post-COVID, we actually find that our anxiety is quite high as a group. So among those sampled, the rates of anxiety are quite a bit higher than they are for the national sample of farmers across both time periods and the Canadian norm, sort of mid-post-COVID. And again, given what the province has experienced, especially in the past year, some of these rates might not be so surprising. One of the things just to highlight here too is our sample is large enough so we can look at some of those differences across gender and industry. So in general, women tended to have, I'm just looking at a comment. Women had marginally higher rates of anxiety than men, which is consistent with the research that comes out of the University of Guelph. And then if we looked at gender by industry, this is where it gets really interesting too, is for example, among say poultry producers, anxiety tends to be a little bit higher than some of the other industry groups, particularly for women poultry producers. Beekeeping, it tends to be quite high also among women compared to men. So this is that kind of level of precision that is going to be really helpful when it comes time to talking about the mental health needs of farmers and really recognizing the differences in those individual industry needs when we're designing either programs or discussing policy recommendations. Okay. And it's not all bad news. I think of all of it, I think this might be some of the most encouraging piece of data that came out of the study, and it's about resilience. So we looked at resilience, and resilience is a person's ability to be able to bounce back after a hardship, maybe thinking of yourself as a strong person who can handle a lot of difficulties, believing that you can achieve your goals despite encountering obstacles along the way. And Alberta farmers, if we compare it to the national farming data from 2021 and then those Canadian norms for this scale, we find that yes, farmers in general tend to have lower levels of resilience compared to the general population. That's kind of been a consistent finding. But what's really interesting is that the Alberta data, our data showed that, or at least the farmers sampled in our survey, reported higher levels of resilience compared to the Canadian average of numbers of ratings of farmers. So what does that mean? Is that surprising? Maybe not. I think do we need more resources for farmers? Absolutely. But we have here, though, is essentially a group of farmers who have weathered many hardships over the years, probably decades, and they keep pushing and have a very positive outlook. And as someone who is familiar with designing programs and implementing them, this is exactly the type of population that you want to work with, right? People who can see the positive side and will push through and kind of believe that they can do it. So we're in a really good position, I think, to be able to do some really great work in Alberta. Okay. So how did people cope? You know, given all of the stress and their levels of, you know, depression and high levels of anxiety, how did folks cope? So not great, I guess, is the overall assessment of this. And I have some quotes from the open-ended responses. So this was an open-ended question that we asked, you know, how do you tend to cope with the stress that you experience? And there's a lot of room for improvement here. And I have these organized in these kind of large bubbles to represent the more common responses that were given. And some people gave more than one response, right? So they may have given something that fell into the self-care category as well as, you know, an exercise category. Okay. But what we see here is that the vast majority engage in strategies that really help them manage the stress associated with the emotions to that stress, you know, often through distraction, rather than changing the way they think or about the stress itself. And in cases, assuming that they can't control the stress that they're experiencing. So we saw a lot of self-care. So in this case, it was a lot of people who may have, like this quote, you know, try to take an evening away from the farm or turn my phone off. Some would maybe turn to prayer. Others would talk about like doing deep breathing exercises. Again, not necessarily addressing how you think about the stress, but it's really helping you cope with the emotions associated with the stress. Other things that were really common was people engaging in hobbies. So maybe going fishing, going for a motorcycle ride, or they would work on their own garden or something. Again, like a lot of distracting type activities that would keep maybe, again, maybe it could distract them from, you know, the stress they're feeling and make them feel good. Being social, for some that was a hobby, but for example, you know, vent to dad, hug the dog, you know, or pet cow, you know, farmer coffee time. And here too, being social didn't necessarily mean always being social with humans, but it may have been being social with like the animals at the farm too. And then exercise. So exercise was really common, but of exercise, it was really the vast majority of those who said exercise, it was about walking. So usually staying on the farm. And that's, I think, a really important point is that for almost all of these, except for hobbies where they may have gone fishing or gone on a motorcycle ride, the vast majority of coping happened on the farm, right? So they didn't talk about taking a vacation or leaving to go someplace. It was really about staying, a lot of what they would do was staying on the farm. And then less common were, you know, substance or risky behavior. So for example, they would maybe say they would drink alcohol, but they would say it wasn't usually in excess, but just to numb the pain. Or they might, one of them that was interesting was, I said they would jump on their motorcycle and drive like an animal, right? So that might be considered a risky behavior. Very few actually turn to a professional, such as like a therapist, right? So about 19 out of the entire sample mentioned this. And then there was almost an equal number who said they do nothing, right? They just maybe work more. So again, I think there's lots of room for improvement here. And it also begs the question, you know, what are some of the barriers that they might be experiencing? So that we do know that there are supports available, but farmers did say in our open-ended question, right, what is preventing them from this? And the most common was it was stigma and pride, right? So I again have some examples of the open-ended comments here, but and I like this one, the stigma in the rural community that farmers don't ask for help / deal with their own issues, paired with putting mental health last behind the work has to be tackled, right? So there's lots of research about health and procrastinating health, right? Like I'll take care of my health later. And I think that farmers, given how busy things can be and the time pressure they feel, right? Putting your own needs second is something that is really common. Time was another factor, again, with kind of balance with lack of access. So you just, usually when you need someone, I agree, it can come at sometimes the busiest time of the year, right? So making sure that we have some of those services or supports available during those times, and it can be really difficult as some farming work is very episodic. Lack of access. So really feeling that there's just not someone who they can talk to who really gets farming or gets where they're at. And I know that's something Linda will be talking about in a little bit about the therapist network, right? So it's really important that for farmers to reach out to someone that they feel that that person has farm credibility and can understand, their unique issues. And then the last one wasn't as common, but it was about not having just a sense that farmers in the industry in general might be in either denial or they just don't recognize that they have symptoms. And it can be also that mental health issues can build up so gradually that it becomes normal, right? We normalize ourselves to that stress, and then we're just not aware of it, of what impact it's having on us, rather. Okay, so there's a lot of data that's in this study, and I only was able to highlight some of some of those key findings. But kind of even just with that, to summarize what we've learned this far, it's that farm stressors, they really vary across the industry and by gender. And it really necessitates having these targeted programs, or essentially just recognizing that farming as a whole is is not homogenous. Alberta farmers, they have high rates of depression and anxiety, but they also have higher levels of resilience. In terms of coping strategies, they tend to use a lot of distraction techniques, right? So this is definitely an area where there's room for improvement, where we can really help farmers by creating programs that can help them not just deal with the emotions of the stress, but the way they think about the stress. And then the last one was really the need to address stigma. Mental health stigma is still very strong in rural communities, so that comes up often in our research, but also in the literature in general, and really building awareness programs about mental health and the services that are available. So what I'm going to do now, I've left time for questions, but I'm going to invite Linda. Would you like Linda to talk about some of the other initiatives? And so you have enough time for that?
Yeah, for sure. And Crystal, if you can figure out how to unmute everyone, that would be awesome. So kind of the approach that AgKnow has been taking is to get some of this baseline research done so we really know where to add the most value. And then we wanted to do what is kind of the quick wins. What can we do right now as we build up our knowledge and understanding within the industry? So one of our strategic goals is to work with mental health, healthcare, and service providers to help them understand the issues in farming and what can be done about them. And so the research that Rebecca's doing is really informing a lot of those a lot of that knowledge, but we've reached out to some of the services that are available right now in Alberta and tried to identify ones that would be available to farmers across the province right now that they could have access to, and just help them to know that those services already exist, and then start working with them in partnership to help them to gain some understanding of the farming industry and what farmers require. So the two that we've come up with so far is Ease Care, which is a virtual doctor's clinic where they're all focused on mental health. All of the physicians are focused on mental health, and they have a psychiatrist right there in their virtual office. And so they're trying to really address not referring people out and them getting lost in the system. And your Alberta Healthcare covers the cost. So that's one, and you can find that one on our Get Support page on our website. The other one was Counseling Alberta, and the government of Alberta gave the counseling center in Calgary Counseling Center some money to expand their program across the province. And so it's on a sliding scale. There's no wait times. You get put with a therapist, and you stay with that therapist throughout the your time with them. And that one you can also get through our Get Support page or going directly to Counseling Alberta and find those supports. So we're working with them to try and figure out how we can improve their knowledge and understanding of farmers and the needs of farmers. And those are services we can offer right now. And the last thing we did is we did a lot of interviews, right, Rebecca? We did quite a few interviews and we found us mattering. There's 12 on our website right now of private practice therapists who either are treating farmers currently, come from a farming background, or are farmers. And so a lot of these are private practice, and so you pay the private practice rates, but we have a free session program to kind of help people to try it out to see if this is what they want, so they can connect through our website to any of the therapists, and the therapists bill us directly. It's completely anonymous. And we just pay for the first 2 sessions, and you try out and see if therapy is right for you. So we've been promoting that free sessions. It just opened up again about a month ago. And so we're really excited to be offering that as a way to get through some stigma and barriers.
Thanks, Linda. Okay, and I have, so just to end, I think just, yeah, thank you for listening. I did want to ensure that there was enough time to have some questions. Otherwise, yes, I had made this presentation way too long, but it was just too many charts and stuff that would have been not encouraging. And also just to thank our funders for this, right? So we have the government of Alberta, and we had funding from the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, now known as SCAP, and Erica, and then the in-kind contributions from the University of Alberta too. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. I don't know if, Linda, if you want to sort of navigate through those questions. I can't easily see it on my screen.
So I think I've unmuted everyone. So if the participants out there would like to ask a question, you should just be able to unmic yourself or unmute yourself and be able to ask a question out loud if you are interested.
And we also have an evaluation form in the chat. So if any of you feel that you could give us some feedback on what we presented today and how things went, we'd really appreciate your feedback. And you can put your question in the chat and we can read it out too if you prefer. So the question is, can you share any more on how society's views farmers is raising concern, worry for farmers? Is it because of mental health stigma or something else?
Yeah, so let me just go back to, oops, back here. Just pull up that. There we go. This one. So yeah, so can you share any about how society views farmers as a raising concern for farmers? So this varies. I was at a talk recently with a farming group, and one of the comments was, we talked about what are some of the stressors that farmers experience, and one of the comments I wrote down because it really stuck with me, and it's like, they want us to feed the world, but then they think they're killing us, right? So there's also concerns about how farmers treat livestock, and I've never met a group of, me included, and Linda included, right? In raising either livestock or what have you. I've never seen a group of individuals who actually care so deeply about the animals in their care than farmers. So I think that there can be farmers can often feel villainized by society, and so it's, and again, why does this happen? It can just, I think it can play on someone's sense of, it just be so inconsistent with how they view themselves, and it's really disheartening, I think. For example, I can use my own situation as an example. So where we live, we had a sheep farm of about, I think we had about 75 sheep at one point. And then beside us, there was a farmer had sold the farm and a subdivision went in. And there were a lot of concerns about, my parents eventually sold the farm because there were they didn't like the noise, the smell, and everything else that came along with the farm. But also they were, my mom always felt that she was unfairly, say, criticized about the well-being of the sheep, right? Is that it's, they were outside too long, or things like that. And I think it can be, yes, just very disheartening for a group of individuals who really do care deeply about the land and about the animals that are in their care, and ensuring that they have a good life, even though many of them might go to market, right? It is in the farmer's sort of nature to really care for those things in its, on its land. I hope that helps answer your question. But that's an example of like something that would be worth kind of digging deeper into, right? What does that actually mean? Like, what are the ways in which we could really help farmers? And if there is some sort of public campaign that could help with that, I think that would something I think we're interested in pursuing.
So Stacy, oh yeah, Stacy is asking a question. She's was very interested to see the comparisons between Canada and Alberta and to hear what AgKnow is pursuing next as a result. So what are some of the next steps in terms of research?
Okay, so that's a really good question. I have a long list of things that I like, hopes and dreams that I want to do. So I can't share all of those now, but one of the things that I'm really interested in, and it's something that came out of the research that we're doing, right? So in addition to this, it's really looking at the stresses, but also like the coping. Like I think that the coping strategies is something that's really interesting. And for a group of individuals, and also to back up, so Dr. Andrea Jones-Bitten's research, right? She is like, she's by trade like a veterinarian, and then when got her degree, her PhD, and it was her through her own observations of people in the agricultural industry struggling that helped her, like, informed her to do her research. So it wasn't that farmers were saying, come help me, right? It was everyone sort of in the periphery saying like, ooh, you need help. So I think for this group of individuals who has just been so long, been so self-reliant, that it's going to be a really interesting group to see like what kind of strategies work for them, because there's not the same strategies you would use for other populations, right? They need really tailored approaches. And I think to ensuring that whoever is delivering those has that farm credibility, because if not, you've just lost them. The Canadian data that I collect, that we were able to collect as part of the study and kind of parcel out, was interesting. Alberta data on indicators of wellness, so depression and anxiety, tended to be about 3 points higher than the Canadian data, which makes sense. Like Alberta has had its fair share of hardships, I think, and it also speaks to the differences across provincial, boundaries, if you will. I don't think that, and I'm guided by the data rather than my own thoughts of this, but the data suggests that a different approach is needed, right? Is that, one, national program might not be the best fit, or it needs to be tailored to meet the needs of those in it. And I think that's important for the farmers themselves to know that we're listening. And I think that's been some of the more positive responses, and why we have engagement is because we are seeking the input of farmers. We're not just saying we know what's best and we're going to do it. Again, we're using the same practices that the University of Guelph team and others have used to. And I think that's really important to be informed by the people you're serving, right? The farmers themselves.
So another question, you mentioned a little bit about how one of the stressors was the industry standard. Was there any data about the difference between conventional versus organic farmers and the standards?
Oh, no, I'd have to probably go through, nothing comes to mind right now, but there was, I think half of the participants included an open-ended response. So I'll have to look through that. But that would be really interesting. In one of the other studies, we did include some individuals who are, say, doing more like either organic farming or conventional farming versus like urban farming. So we have some of those splits, and there are differences in terms of either what are some of the major stressors or the regulations that they have to follow. So again, I think that's a really good question. I'm going to write that one down. Okay.
Another question here. Also, a lot of farmers have second jobs and work off the farm and are working long hours. So when they say they don't have time for mental health or physical health to see a therapist or physician, how do we change their thinking?
Oh, right. How do you, how do you change their thinking? I think it's, there's different types of like cognitive behavioral strategies that you can use. However, without having programs or policies that help farmers, right, to live their life, I mean, cognitive strategies will only take you so far, right? I mean, there'll be ways to, I think, prevent them from having suicidal thoughts. But if we really want them to thrive and to live their productive and fulfilling lives, I think that with some of those other coping strategies should be balanced with having programs and policies that really work for farmers. But that's, how do you, and so many of them, do have jobs either for because they need the extra money or the benefits, or
a lot of times the production from your farm doesn't cover the cost of the tools or the land that you need to actually do the farming. And so without having that other income, either from a spouse or from family members or inheritance, you're put in the position of having to have an off-farm job in order to build up your operation to a place where you can have it as a full-time income. So it's a conundrum of getting into farming, and it's touches all the pieces of research that Rebecca's working on, the transition, the stress and coping. It's all related to that same thing, and it comes back to regulations and programs as well, because that's why we have the beginner farming loans and that kind of thing to kind of help lubricate things to make that a little bit easier. But the startup is always the hardest, for sure.
Yeah, and the talk I was at recently, we were talking about off-farm work, and someone had mentioned the stressors, and they had mentioned off-farm work, that they have a full-time job and then also farming on top of that. And I asked you, what do you do in your other job? And they laughed. They're like, I work at a farm, right? So it was working. So sometimes it's, when you think about off-farm job, it might be at another farm, right? And there's benefits to that, I suppose, but I thought that was funny.
It's nice when your off-farm job actually enhances your own farming operation. So there are a lot of truck drivers out there with their off-farm job as their truck driving, and it fits in with their own operation. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky to get in, for sure. Awesome. I think that's all we have for questions, and we're pretty much at the end of our time. Again, there's a link in the chat if anyone would like to help us with our evaluations. We'd really appreciate your feedback and participating in that. Oh, Susan Bell Ferguson is from the federal government on the policy side, and she says, of interest, public opinion research undertaken by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada has shown that Canadians overwhelmingly appreciate and support Canadian farmers. It's distressing to see the data demonstrating a disconnect between what they believe Canadians perceive of them. And that's really cool. Thanks for that, Susan. That's really good. And I think a lot of the negativity comes through in social media, and farmers who have tried to put themselves out there on social media to show what they do in their farming and then get bombed by some really aggressive, negative people is probably part of that.
And it might just be that there's not the numbers, but sometimes those can be just the loudest, right?
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
I know, yes, it's not, I mean, I think Canadians overall support farmers. It's just sometimes it's just the ones that are loud are kind of the negative ones, and those are the ones that we hear, right? If you're a farmer. So that's a really good point.
If you want to know how well Canadians support their farmers, the Don't Label My Beef campaign that happened overwhelmed the government with so many emails. They had to finally phone and ask people to stop sending emails in support of Canadian farmers. And even during the BSE crisis, and the way the Canadians stepped up to the plate and ate through the surplus beef and kept our farmers going was really inspiring. So I think it's a lot about remembering and celebrating those moments, I think. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody.